All right, let's take a look at the f-stops or the aperture settings. And we talked about shutters a moment ago, and so now let's talk about how f-stops come to play when we're talking about exposure. Okay, so the typical f-stops are f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22, and f32. Now, something unique about f-stops that I want you to notice is that every other one is a double. So f2, and we skip over f2.8 and go to f4, you can see that 2 and 4, of course, are double numbers. And then we would look at f8, and over is now f16, and f11 to f22, and f16, every other one, again doubling that one being f32. And here f2.8 over to f5.6, and then f4 over to f8. So every other f number is a double of the previous f number. So take a close look at that. Let's talk about what the aperture or the f-stop's purpose is, or what it does. It controls the amount of light that passes through the lens of the camera. Okay, now the difference between that and the shutter, don't forget, controls the amount of time the shutter is open. This controls the amount of light that passes through the lens of the camera. And then the second thing the aperture does is it controls depth of field. And we will show examples of that here too in just a moment. All right, let's take a look at what we're talking about. We're talking about apertures if you're not used to seeing this. The smaller the f number, the wider the aperture of the lens, and the less depth of field in the photograph. We'll talk more about depth of field here in a moment and exactly what that means. The larger the f number, the narrower the aperture and the more depth of field in the photograph. So let's take a look at f1.4. You can see how wide the aperture is, and that more light will pass through this particular lens than it would with the lens that is set at f16. At f16, notice how narrow that opening is, and less light is going to get through the lens. f5.6 is kind of a midway between the f1.4 and the f16 example that I'm showing you here. So the wider the aperture, the more light that passes through, the less depth of field that we have. And f16 in this example is less light passing through the lens, and we gain more depth of field when the lens is set at a smaller aperture setting. Let's take a look at depth of field. Let's look at its definition. I like to define it as the amount of apparent sharpness from the point of critical focus toward and away from the camera. So let's take a look at what's happening here with this particular diagram. If we use a wide aperture, such as f1.4 that you saw on the previous slide, we can actually focus on something out here. What we're doing really is we're focusing right here on this flower, and then with a wide aperture, this is our only area of crisp focus. Everything toward the camera and away from the camera, from the point of critical focus, which is right here, becomes less sharp. And that amount of sharpness will depend upon what aperture setting that you are using. So let's say then, for an example, using our previous aperture, that this one here was taken at f1.4. All right, let's take a look at this one. Let's say that this one was taken at f16, like we talked about in the previous slide. This is still our point of critical focus right here. The camera is focused still on this flower, But notice the range of crisp focus now has extended toward and away from the camera from the point of critical focus. All right, if we take a photograph at a smaller aperture setting, this is the type of sharpness that we can expect from the point of critical focus. So in other words, just about everything looks in sharpness, and this photograph would be difficult to tell just where you actually focus the camera. Where the one where we're showing the f1.4 up above, the obvious is going to be the middle flower in this diagram, because that's the only thing that is sharp using an f1.4 aperture. This next photograph, we're going to look at some coins and put this into terms that you would actually see in a photograph. The top one, or the upper left photograph here, is what we would call shallow depth of field, and this was taken at f2.8. Now, it may be difficult to see in this video, but this quarter right here is the only one that is sharp. The ones that recede into the background, which is this one and this one, become less sharp as we travel through the photograph. The one down below, all three had the same equal sharpness, even though the point of critical focus is still right here on this quarter. This particular photograph was taken at f22. Again, a much narrower aperture than the one up above at f2.8. In this photograph that we've taken here at f22, if we were just to look at this photograph by itself, it would be difficult to tell which quarter I actually have focused on. But in the two photographs that I'm showing you here, the focus remains unchanged in both. The quarter that you see in the very immediate foreground is where the camera has been focused. Let's take a look at these pictures that I have of two giraffes. And notice the background is very hard to see. You can tell there are trees back there, but they're so out of focus that your eye tends to stick right to the giraffes that you see here in what we would call the middle ground. Notice the grass here in the very immediate foreground is also blurred out, and then it becomes sharper right where the giraffes are standing. So when we look at this photograph, we can actually selectively adjust the aperture to give us this type of focus. And the neat thing about this, your eye will not see it in this fashion. It can only be brought to you through photography. This photograph was taken with a telephoto lens. I believe the aperture was something about, or somewhere set at about f8. And so really, all we're getting in sharpness is just the mid area of this photograph. And notice that all through here, the grass is not very sharp. And of course, as we recede into the background, all this area here that you're seeing is out of focus. And keeping the sharpness then right on the subject, and your eye is drawn to those two animals, beautiful animals they were, and any distractions in the background are blurred out. And so when you start to really think about taking photography and improving your photographs, you really do want to consider and think about depth of field, because you have the ability to control this on your camera. Okay, let's go on to the next photograph here and take a look at that. Okay, let's see here. All right, here is a picture of a lion, and again, the background is blurred out. You cannot see really what is going on back in this area through here. There is lots of white things that you can see in the type of grass, these little white parts of the grass and the weeds. And I didn't want to carry that throughout the photograph because it can become somewhat distracting to the eye. So by blurring out the background, by focusing in close on the lion, again taken with a 500 millimeter lens, and using a wide aperture, in this case of f5.6, the background now is totally blurred out, and the only thing in sharpness is what is around the foreground here in the photograph, and then the focusing took place, of course, right in here. Okay. Another example of just a bug on a leaf coming in very, very close with a macro lens using a very wide aperture. And what you're seeing here is reflections of light that is being reflected off of other leaves within the photograph. But they are so blown out of proportion that your eye tends to stay right where the insect is, and of course our point of focus is that as well. Now, looking at what we would call wide depth of field, such as this photograph here of the sunflowers in the very immediate foreground, and carrying through all the way through to what we'd call infinity of the photograph, everything in this photograph is sharp from the very immediate foreground to as far back in the background as you can see. Again, this probably doesn't show up as well on the video that you're looking at, but everything is sharp from this point in here clear back to in here. And this was taken with a wider angle lens and using f/22, which will give me complete sharpness from the very immediate foreground to the background. And actually, the sharpness, or a point of focus, I should say, was on this sunflower right here. So when we focus on things in the very immediate foreground, we can actually carry sharpness all the way through if we use a narrow aperture, in this case, such as f/22. Okay, these are the examples that I wanted to show you, and I hope that you've enjoyed looking at these, and I hope that you've understood what apertures and shutter speeds and how they tie together along with ISO speed, how they all interrelate. A little bit later on in this week's learning module, we are going to tie all three together. The ASA, or the ISO setting of a camera, or the film speed, what we call this film speed even in digital photography, shutter speeds, and f-stops, because when we put them all together, that's what gives us exposure, so that we don't overexpose or underexpose. We always want proper exposure, and then we have to make choices of sharpness of motion and or how much depth of field do we want in the photographs that we're taking. So decisions have to be made that depend upon the amount of light, the film speed setting that we have in the camera, and then the type of subject matter that we're photographing, along with the different focal length of lenses that you may or may not have. So I'll be talking with you here in a little bit about when you look at the next video, and we'll be talking about what's called equivalent exposure.